Hello, everyone. I'm Ghattas, contributing writer at The Atlantic, and I'm standing in for Ivo Daalder, who is away this week. This is World Review, a weekly look at the news from around the world from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And it has been a busy week, also a heartbreaking week. We're going to start with the latest from Syria and Turkey, where the toll of last week's earthquake is now nearing 44,000 dead. And Turkey's President Erdogan and Syria's Assad are already playing politics. And then we have China and more balloons over the US, or are they? And are there 99 balloons yet? Joe Biden is expected to speak to China's Xi Jinping to diffuse tension. And then again, still Ukraine. We're coming up on the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia seems to be preparing for a spring offensive, and the cost of war is dawning on everyone. And Ukraine is using ammunition faster than its allies can produce. A lot to discuss. And joining me this week, we have Susan Glasser, international correspondent for the New Yorker in Washington, D.C., Peter Spiegel in New York, U.S. managing editor for the Financial Times, and in
Did we lose Kim there?
I think we did.
That's great. The guest will take over the show.
Yes, Kim Ghattas takes over the show. We'll see what Ivo thinks about it. I'm going to try to do my best to fill in for him, and you're all going to make it easy for me. Prashant, I am going to start with you. I promise not to be too tough, but I want to start with Turkey and Syria. This is the worst natural disaster to occur in Turkey in recent history. It comes just 3 months ahead of the general and presidential elections, which is supposed to be taking place in May. There's talk of delay now. The logistics of holding the vote will be difficult. And both Erdogan and the opposition are calculating already how this might benefit them or not. Erdogan is trying to deflect blame for all the shoddy construction that's taken place during his time in power. We saw the arrests of all the contractors, etc. How do you think this is going to play out over the next few weeks and few months?
I mean, it's so difficult to parse all the various dynamics here. What we can say is this earthquake really pulls so many of Turkey's dynamics. It really crystallizes a lot of the problems that Turkey faces and a lot of the movement away from democracy that we've seen under Erdogan as president, whether it's, the suspension of Twitter, which activists have sort of widely said has made it harder for rescue efforts, whether it's, as you say, the discussion about the construction amnesty back a few years ago. It kind of speaks to a lot of, Erdogan obviously sort of very much promoted the construction industry in years past. We're really seeing so many of the things that often these crises bring a country's problems to the fore and just magnify them so enormously. And I think we see that with Turkey right now, in the sense of this country has made a lot of economic development, as we all know when we visit Turkey in sort of decades compared to decades past. But it's really quite sad how this earthquake, in some ways bookends an Erdogan political rise. The last enormous one was in 1999, just before AK, his party, really rose to the fore in those parliamentary elections. And then, you mentioned in the intro Syria as well. There, it's in some ways an even more depressing dynamic because aid took so long to reach Syria and Assad, which I thought your FT piece really amazingly captured, is now we're seeing and this has been happening for several years. We shouldn't think that the earthquake is the last step, is the only step in this normalization of Bashar al-Assad, but that has been happening for several years. And now, after this civil war in which he has mercilessly attacked his own people, it seems as though now he's sort of accepted once again, or he may well soon be just as a normal political figure once more.
Prashant, can I just ask you? You mentioned the issue on the construction and clearly the failures of the construction industry to live up to the building standards. But the one that's been more interesting to me, to be honest with you, on here is the slow reaction of the state to actually bring in aid. I mean, a lot of the reporting on the ground has been people saying, where is the government? Where is the government? Now, look, happens the world over, but politicians do take a hit from it. I mean, all we have to do is look at, Hurricane Katrina, and they hit the Bush administration, took on it for not showing up and helping. I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about that and whether that is, we're already seeing any signs that that is eating into Erdogan's popularity, particularly with these elections coming up.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Erdogan, to Peter's point, has been playing politics from the beginning. We were just discussing before we went on air that he called mayors of towns allied to him from the AKP party and not from opposition parties, which is just an incredible thing to do as a president of a country when your citizens have just gone through what they've been through. And he course corrected, but it's quite stunning to watch.
Yeah, I would defer to Kim on this particularly because you've covered this for much longer than I have. It feels to me as though it's exactly right. I mean, this is, in some ways, we're just seeing raw Erdogan in a lot of ways. This is the kind of core of the politician he is, and obviously we would hope that he would be a statesman. We always do, but you're right that this is not just a Turkey problem. In some ways, several other countries, the politicians, the leadership of countries, fail to live up to the hopes that their people have in moments of crisis, and certainly seems that way now. It's very easy to say that the people are angry at him, and in May they'll punish him at the ballot box. But Turkey, as we all know, is such his grip on the Turkish political system is strong. But two, I think it's often easy to dismiss that as the only reason he wins, and actually he does win because for a long time he has been popular among a sort of large tranche of Turkish voters, and frankly the opposition has not been terribly competent at challenging him. And even now, I think if we look at sort of the opposition leaders, it's not like they're astonishing people with their charisma. It's largely to do with uniting against an Erdogan who has maybe run his course. I don't know what the three of you think, but I feel like the one thing I've learned in a career in journalism is just betting against people like Erdogan is a bad idea. The sort of system and the politics favor him in so many ways, and he's talented in that political sphere, and so we shouldn't underestimate his ability to win.
Peter, how do you think this earthquake, and I hate to use the term, but we can see the politicking both in Turkey and in Syria, and Prashant points out to Bashar al-Assad, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But how do you think that this earthquake, how do you think Erdogan is going to potentially use this to improve what have been difficult relations with, the US, but also Europe? I mean, Europe and the US have been very generous in sending help to Turkey. How does this reframe the geopolitics?
Well, classically, it was a Turkish earthquake that led to rapprochement between Greece and Turkey, as Prashant pointed out at the beginning of the Erdogan regime. So he has been able to, and frankly, other states have been able to use a disaster response as a way to thaw relations. Now, I got to say, the regional tensions right now are really terrible, right? Erdogan has been flying fighter planes into Greek airspace. Obviously the tensions along the Turkish-Syrian border. The Israelis are angry at everyone. So it goes from a very, very bad place, and even a little bit of thawing is, I don't think, necessarily going to get us to a place where we were 20 years ago after the earthquake that sort of brought Greece and Turkey together. But we'll have to watch. We'll have to watch. I mean, we have seen, as you said, a lot of governments that are seen as, I don't say pariahs, but sometimes are seen as enemies of the Turkish state show up in mass and help out. I think, to be honest with you, it's going to have less impact on geopolitics than on domestic politics, which is why I've slightly been obsessing about this. I mean, what is interesting to me is, Prashant is right in that Erdogan has won, not just because he's an autocrat, but actually he is genuinely popular, but genuinely popular usually in the countryside, right? Amongst the more religious groups. He is not popular in the urban centers with the more sort of westernized elites. Now, this is an earthquake in the rural areas, and if that constituency feels like Erdogan has ignored them, I think it's going to have knock-on domestic effects, which may force Erdogan to become even more nationalistic and even lash out even more against the Greeks and his other traditional rivals in the region. So they will have knock-on effects on each other. I think we can hope that disaster diplomacy does play out here in a region that has been incredibly tense over the last few years. But I got to say, given the domestic political situation in Turkey, I'm skeptical. So that would be how I would frame it.
Susan, what are you hearing in Washington? We've seen, American officials come out, in force, publicly sending aid, USAID, Samantha Power, Jake Sullivan went to the embassy to sign the condolence book. How do you think it's playing out? Obviously, no one will discuss openly now the politics of it, even though on the ground this is what's happening. And then I'll ask you about Syria and go back to Prashant as well on that point.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, there's been no more challenging ally and partner in recent years than Erdogan and Turkey for a succession of U.S. leaders. Obama, Trump, and Biden have all struggled in different ways to deal with the challenge of Erdogan. And frankly, Erdogan has been actually quite inconsistent, and he has certainly leveraged his role inside NATO, an alliance that operates on consensus and unanimity wherever possible. And he has used that in many ways to, place himself at the center of sort of geopolitical events. And so the timing of this is very notable. He's been playing, we haven't mentioned yet Russia and Ukraine, but, Erdogan has been perhaps the key figure both in a constructive and a non-constructive way from the point of view of Washington when it comes to this war as it's played out over the last year. On the constructive front, this agreement to make sure that grain was exported through the Black Sea probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Erdogan. This is very important. Obviously, Ukraine was a major international supplier of grain. This was beginning to cause, a bread crisis in parts of the world where that is a huge problem because Putin and Russia were essentially blockading Ukraine's Black Sea ports and stopping the harvest from being exported. So on the one hand, constructive. On the other hand, he has been holding up, Erdogan has been holding up the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, which is probably one of the most significant geopolitical results of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has been to essentially jolt these two very important and strategically located European powers out of their decades, and in Sweden's case, centuries-long tradition of neutrality into wanting to join NATO, exactly the results Vladimir Putin would have least wanted, and yet it's been Erdogan who's been the agent of holding that up. It does look like that may eventually go through now, but I would just point that out because I think it's extremely significant moment, both in terms of Turkey's internal politics with this upcoming May election, and also it's not obvious, to Peter's point, on the one hand, Erdogan may wish to appear to be the statesman. He may wish to, emphasize his long leadership of Turkey, his ability to put Turkey at the center of global events as a way of distracting. On the other hand, as when we've seen many Russian leaders take this course, my fear right now is that, this is exactly the sort of internal disaster that somebody, a strong man like Erdogan, wants to use as a distraction, and needs a distraction. He needs an external enemy. Probably Greece won't cut it at the moment, but that means that,
Greek foreign minister was one of the first the first foreign minister from Europe to visit.
Well, so that's right. And to Peter's point, often people do use disaster relief as a way to increase, pave over tensions. And you saw the Greeks offering a lot of support. I noticed the Israelis tweeting out moving video. Actually, Israelis have very good disaster recovery teams. And, they were out there in the rubble, digging out Turks. There's actually an incredibly moving video that I believe it was the IDF tweeted out of the Israeli rescue team rescuing some Turks and weeping. So, this is good, what you might call, kind of soft power,
international support and soft power. If I'm not mistaken, the Israelis did have to leave for security reasons. So that's a negative point for Erdogan. But I do want to touch on Syria briefly, because it is very important, and this is going to change the geopolitics of the region if President Assad gets his way. Prashant, you were referring to that just a moment ago. I did write that piece in the FT talking about how Assad was using this moment to try to rehabilitate himself in the international community. After 12 years of war and bombing his own people, you see aid landing in Damascus, a lot of difficulty with reaching the northwest, which is held by the opposition. And it's quite incredible that an earthquake might save the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But Susan, I wanted to ask you, is this debate around Syria and Assad even on the radar in Washington?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up, Kim, because that's the other thing I wanted to say. In Washington, while people are sending aid and, sort of issuing the right kind of statements and the like, what I've actually been struck by is how sort of pro forma and checking the box that's been. Right now is a very inward looking moment in American politics, to the extent that it's not, obviously we're consumed, by the Russia's war in Ukraine, but also with this sort of new levels of hysteria and concern about China. And, right now, the Middle East, Syria, Turkey, do not register really in Washington politics. I've been struck. I couldn't believe that Joe Biden, his State of the Union address came right after the earthquake. He did not even issue, the pro forma kind of words of sympathy and support that you might have imagined to a major NATO partner like Turkey. I was pretty shocked by that. I noticed, very quick kind of cleanup in aisle 9, by Secretary of State Tony Blinken and others the next day. But, from what I know of the region and also of Erdogan and his diplomats in particular, they're very prickly, and they would have noticed this and perceived this to be a major slight.
There is a bandwidth issue, even though there is, earthquake diplomacy. Prashant, yesterday, the ranking Democratic senator on the Foreign Relations Committee said that Assad's behavior was disgusting and that he was a war criminal. Susan points out that, it's not on the radar. And yet the US has 900 troops in northeast Syria. USAID is assisting organizations in opposition-held northwest. Could there be some kind of momentum, including regional, to find a more positive way forward for Syria without absolving Assad of all his crimes? The Minister of Foreign Affairs of the UAE's been to Damascus again. I'm hearing reports that the Saudi foreign minister might be visiting next week. Saudi Arabia has been very hesitant to rekindle ties with Assad over the last 12 years. The Middle East, you've covered the Middle East. Things move in interesting ways sometimes.
They do. I mean, again, perhaps it's my sort of, I think, journalistic cynicism. I find it really hard to believe, Kim, you've written a lot about impunity over the years. It's the sort of thing that we used to talk about a lot when we work together. And I have a really hard time believing that Bashar al-Assad will face any kind of genuine punishment for what's happened over the past decade plus, that effectively, I have a very vivid recollection of, in the early stages of the Syrian civil war, talking to a colleague who'd covered the region for a long time and asked, what do you think happens? And at the time I was relatively new to the region, only covering for a couple of years. And he said, Bashar al-Assad will stay. He will kill everyone if he wants to hold on to power. And, quite depressingly, he seems to have successfully done so. 13, in 2018 or so, several countries began somewhat having talks with the Syrian regime. And so this is not, we shouldn't make it seem as though, to some extent, that the earthquake has suddenly launched this. It's actually been a long-term process of normalizing Bashar al-Assad to several countries that had historically opposed him. This, I think, is the latest stage of it. And my worry is it confirms the notion that he's not going anywhere.
I mean, Kim, I think you're right, and the people to watch are the Gulfies on this. I mean, this has been a regime that has oppressed largely the Sunni population within Syria, and you have this strange new alliance between the Gulf royalty and the hardline Israelis, both of whom are quite opposed to the Assad regime. So if you start seeing the Emiratis and start seeing the Saudis showing up in Damascus, I think that's a sign of what Prashant is saying, which is the weather is heading in the direction of some sort of I don't want to say peace agreement, but certainly a welcoming of Assad back into sort of the civilized group of nations.
And yet U.S. sanctions and the Caesar Act remain in place. So that's an interesting one to navigate for reconstruction. Natural disasters should bring people together, but clearly here we're seeing opportunism potential political upheaval. And I think it could reshape the region in some way or another. One country that is also sending aid, of course, to both Turkey and Syria, but Assad's Syria is China. Iran's president is China, and an ally of Syria is Iran, and Xi Jinping has just welcomed him, President Raisi, to Beijing. That's also an interesting relationship to watch. And you'd think Xi Jinping is a bit too busy with his balloons. Peter, get us up to date there, because we've had more balloons or whatever they were being shot down over the US. Were they, Chinese balloons, surveillance balloons? There was a great editorial in the Financial Times about the level of hysteria, which has been unseen since the 50s, and suggesting that this episode has revealed also gaps in air and sea surveillance capabilities. What is the latest? What is going on?
Yeah, well, first of all, can I say you're right in saying Chinese balloons or whatever they are. So I, for one, just want to say I welcome our new alien overlords, since clearly we've started an interstellar war with UFOs, because that's
one general said he couldn't
be clear. They said no.
John Kirby
they actually said no. It
John
absolutely
Kirby
is not. Alien.
But that's what they would say.
The fact that John Kirby had to stand at the White House podium and says we do not think it's aliens, that's how crazy it got this week. Look, in all seriousness, let me try to take recent events and work way backwards, because you mentioned in your introductory remarks, Kim, that are we in a position of where we were trying to thaw things, right? We had Biden for the first time address the crisis, whatever it is, the incident yesterday. We have Tony Blinken is now in Munich, the Munich Security Conferences. Is supposed to be meeting with Wang Yi, his sort of Chinese counterpart. There seems to be some effort to try to diffuse this, and yet Biden's language is also, tough. It was we're not going to put up with Chinese balloons flying over the U.S. We're going to shoot them down if they want to do that. We also have the slightly odd case where Michael Case, who's the top China hand at the Pentagon, landed today in Taipei. So is that trying to thaw? Is that not trying to thaw? So I think what is going on right now is, I think in their heart of hearts, the administration would love to get this behind them, but particularly because of the domestic politics on this, there's so much heat from the Hill right now for the Republican right saying, you've been soft. You didn't shoot down the Chinese balloon quickly, and that clearly has. I mean, they don't acknowledge this, but they clearly forced both the Pentagon, NORAD, to open the aperture of their radar, so they started catching up more things, including one trade publication. It seems like it might have been a hobbyist balloon that got shot down by the U.S. Air Force, but also trigger happy for political reasons. They don't want to be caught, again, allowing something to go from Montana to South Carolina without doing anything about it. So it's become incredibly political right now. I think what we will see at Munich is a meeting between Blinken and Yi, which will attempt to cool the relationships. But the fact of the matter is, what we're discovering is that we haven't been seeing these things, right? They went back and looked at old radar tapes. Apparently, there have been balloons flying over Texas and Florida during the Trump administration. There apparently is a international network of Chinese spy balloons that have been floating around that we didn't know about until now. Now, look, I think in the grand scheme of things, why this is we get to the point about this is slight hysteria is, in the grand scheme of spy versus spy, balloons traveling 60,000 feet is the least of our problems with the Chinese, right? I mean, their abilities in cyber espionage, in old-fashioned rounding up of the CIA's network within China, within recent years, all of our sources in China were exposed and rounded up. I mean, the amount of intelligence challenges facing the U.S. when it comes to China are extreme, and balloons is not really high on the list, but because of the politics involved, and it is dramatic, right? I mean, we found out about it because a reporter in Billings, Montana, looked up and took a picture of a balloon. I mean, it is made for TV. The cable networks have gone all in about it. The American people are care about it. So it is one of those foreign policy stories that has really resonated with the American voter, and as a result, they've got to figure out a way to look tough, even if they want to diffuse it with the Chinese right now.
Susan, do you agree that it's hysteria, and does it point to what is really a difficult moment in the China-U.S. relationship or competition?
Yeah, I mean, Peter's right that it's broken through with the American public in a way that most foreign policy crises and controversies, including those involving China, have not. Arguably, much more significant intelligence intrusions have occurred in recent years, and actually, you've heard increasing level of alarm from across the U.S. government around this issue in recent years, and yet the American public has largely been, sort of indifferent. Yeah, and then you get a balloon, and it sort of crystallizes the whole thing. It does spring to mind the old adage here in Washington that it's also you don't actually want. It's not good when the politicians and the domestic political types start talking about your foreign policy issue. And that's when, hysteria and demagoguery kick in. And we've certainly seen a large amount of that, but remember, Joe Biden came into office saying that, essentially the rise of China and figuring out how to constrain and contain that is going to be the greatest challenge for the United States of this century. And that's something that increasingly has been a consensus among Democrats and Republicans. Now, there's a, sort of chest beating, I'm tougher than the other guy, let me shoot it down, kind of macho BS. But the policy shift is real. It's been happening for quite some time. And what's interesting is I was doing a really interesting conversation this week on, it's actually been 20 years since the beginning of the war in Iraq and the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq. And there's a new book out having a panel discussion. Is fascinating. One of the participants discussing, what do we learn or not learn, as the case may be, from Washington going to war on a kind of a false, expectation in Iraq and in the aftermath of 9/11. Bob Zoellick, who served later in the Bush administration as a deputy secretary of state, was one of the participants, not a big, cheerleader for the war in Iraq. And Zoellick was very interesting. He was talking about China. He had a piece this week in the Washington Post making a very unfashionable argument, basically about the need to dial it down. But what I was struck by is, whatever you think of his policy views here, we are in a situation where everybody's a China hawk now in Washington, but ask them, to what end? What is the goal that you are looking to achieve here? And certainly no one's outright saying, well, we'd like regime change, we'd like to get rid of the Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping. And yet I haven't really heard people being able to articulate what is the goal, except, sort of competition for its own sake. And I do think you can immediately see in a crisis like this balloon crisis, that you run up the escalation ladder pretty quickly.
It's interesting you say that with Zoellick.
Ballooning.
Yes, crisis ballooning. I was just going to say, Susan's point is interesting that it was Zoellick who was talking about this. Remember, Zoellick's view was responsible stakeholder, right? When that was his phrase. And I think if you were to ask in the heart of hearts, in not just Zoellick but other Washington policymakers, that's what they would like to get to the Chinese to be. It's interesting also. I just sitting here in Brooklyn, there is also a difference between Washington and New York on this, because you do have Wall Street in particular that is actually getting kind of concerned about the rhetoric coming out of Washington. This is a big growing market. This is the home of, I mean, frankly, part of it is just making a buck in a big growing market. But part of it is also they do see that business and investment is a way to moderate the Chinese, behavior internationally, to wed them into the international system. And that's an unfashionable view in Washington, and has been for some time now, as Susan says, on a bipartisan basis increasingly. Well, but there are still a lot of remnants of that here in New York.
Can I just say, though, that that's in the view of Washington, that's a failed view. I mean,
exactly.
It's not, the idea is that that was Washington's policy, the responsible stakeholder policy, but in fact, it didn't work out. We would have liked it to work out that way, but in fact, the connection that we presumed between economic liberalization and political liberalization didn't work out.
I would just say that there is still Hank Paulson types here in New York, on Wall Street, Ray Dalio. I mean, there are other people like that who still believe that is possible, and are getting increasingly alarmed at the rhetoric coming out of Washington. It's just interesting to me that the finance and political elites are beginning to clash on this.
I wonder who's more realistic. Prashant, you and I have had this discussion quite a few times when you were editing me at the Atlantic about, responsible stakeholder, connecting China to the global economy, the WTO. Now we have this international fracas and hysteria, which further highlights China's ambitions and the potential failings of that view. And it also shows how China melds its civilian and military capabilities in ways that, the US just doesn't necessarily do in the same way. So they have an advantage there.
I would say the US does do it just in slightly different ways. Fundamentally, DoD only talks to like a small number of defense contractors and has a strong relationship with them. China obviously has a much sort of greater control over its defense companies, and all companies are defense companies fundamentally in China. A couple of things from this conversation that struck me, I find this idea that New York differs from Washington is interesting to me, but also New York differs from the U.S. business elite and the U.S. business decisions. The finance types, Ray Dalio doesn't have actually a stake in China, but if you look at perhaps the American company that has the greatest stake in China is Apple, and Apple is diversifying away from China. The actual actions of American businesses indicate they do not want to be as dependent on China as they were, either as a market or in their supply chains. And the other thing that's kind of fascinating to me is, fundamentally, we're talking here about a discussion of rhetoric, not a change in policy. American policy in China has hardened on secular trends over administrations against China. I would argue that the Joe Biden administration is much tougher on China than Donald Trump ever was. And it's not even close. The semiconductor sanctions are, by an order of magnitude, much more aggressive than anything.
And angered a lot of our allies, the Dutch, the Japanese,
right. And exactly, the force multiplier that they've gotten with the Dutch and the Japanese precisely has been huge. And then, there's more and more talk that, in the climate space that we might see increasing competition and less cooperation. So we can talk all we want about the rhetoric, but actually the policy is on a secular trend now. Whether or not some people are dovish or not, the next administration will probably be tougher on China than the last one. This is sort of how policy is likely to go, especially now that the Biden administration has set this trend that you could basically say any technology now is dual use because China has a military industrial complex that goes across its business and political sphere. If you can say that a semiconductor is a dual use military technology, then, anything can be dual use. And functionally, the United States can, and has shown a willingness to really attack the Chinese economy in a far more aggressive way than I think anybody has fully grasped yet. And I think the fallout from this is really significant. It is right to call this balloon situation hysteria to some degree, but it is also indicative of it's sort of, I find it more illustrative than anything, in the sense that previously the China conversation was one that was ensconced in places like DC and New York, but now it's one that brings in the American voter on the seminal issue of foreign policy in the United States. And I understand why people in DC are, kind of frustrated, ordinary voters are now having to grapple with this. But if, as the Biden and Trump administrations believed, effectively this is like 1965 in the Soviet Union, then surely you want the American voter, because that's how you build a national consensus on the greatest foreign policy issue of our time. Otherwise, this will just become, sort of a conversation among elites.
And when they shut down TikTok, our teenagers will as well.
But Xi Jinping is going to make everything better and hunky-dory by apparently giving a peace speech on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. That news just out this afternoon. And Ukraine, really 1 year already. Susan, you and I were on this show just over a year ago, on February 11th, talking to Ivo about the intelligence that the US was putting out. The Olympics were taking place in China. Many people were dismissive. Putin will never invade, or not in any big way. But you were very worried. I listened to that show again just this afternoon, and you said you weren't sure there was any real diplomacy possible. Looking ahead today, what are your concerns about where things stand, how long this could go on, how things evolve, from war fatigue among allies to ammunition supply issues? It's looking tough. War is tough. I don't mean to make light of it, but what is your sense of how this goes on?
Yeah, look, 1 year in, we have to say that this is a tragedy on an enormous scale. And I do remember that conversation, Kim, and I was understandably frustrated as one would be when there is an invasion force of 190,000 Russians, and so many people were in denial up until the very moment that this catastrophic invasion occurred, the largest land war in Europe since the end of World War II. And yet people in the United States, people in Europe, right now the Munich Security Conference is happening. What was the big talk at the Munich Security Conference a year ago? It was Europeans in a state of delusion, to be honest, in a state of delusion. And so one thing we can say is that many of the fantasies and illusions about 20 years of failed understanding of Russia and under Vladimir Putin, sort of came crashing down, along with many expectations about the strength of the Russian military and, what it could and could not accomplish through military means. I'm glad you pointed out the no limits friendship and partnership announced by Russia and China during those Olympics. The new axis between these emergent dictatorial powers is one that should be concerning to anyone who cares about freedom and democracy in the world. And so in some ways, I continue to believe that the enormity of what we are witnessing is quite large in geopolitical terms, and so large in many ways that we're still sort of in denial about it. And it's much easier to default, to kind of smaller issues rather than to confront the big issue that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and the direction of their countries does confront us with. And so I think this is, really a pretty epical event. Certainly the scale of the tragedy and the deaths and casualties and disruption are very significant. This is not just some irrelevant border skirmish here. Okay, we are talking about 1 year into this conflict, even by the lower Western estimates, as opposed to those of Ukraine, deaths in the hundreds of thousands. There are, according to the International Organization of Migration, there are 5 million Ukrainians who are internally displaced and 8 million who have had to leave the country. These are big numbers. Russia has waged not just a brutal war at the front, but they have waged war against the civilian population of Ukraine. We are talking about atrocities. We are talking about human rights catastrophe on a scale, again, that I think is so significant. People are having a hard time actually confronting what's happening. And we are talking about new waves of warfare, drone attacks far from the front lines. And I say all these things because, I think often the foreign policy conversation can, lose the reality of the ground and, can default into a kind of technocratic discussion about aid. And so I would also just say that 1 year in perhaps a more positive sense, the kind of leadership that we have seen from Washington has also defied expectations, and the ability to put together a bipartisan coalition inside a very fragmented United States to supply and to vote for more than $50 billion worth of aid. That was unthinkable 1 year ago. And then also to keep NATO more or less together and even to prospectively expand it to Finland and Sweden is a remarkable turnabout. So, don't pretend to know what we don't know looking ahead. But I would say that, conventional wisdom from places like the Munich Security Conferences is often wrong.
And I just to echo what Susan said.
Go ahead, because what Susan just said about don't pretend to know what we don't know. Actually, I wanted you to try to pretend that you know what is going to happen.
Yes, that's my role on the show, isn't it?
Because it's not going well for Putin in many ways. Although from my vantage point, dictators love it when they're still in power, no matter how many other people they've killed and no matter how much destruction they've caused. But his military hasn't managed to make any gains in the last couple of weeks of sustained assault. They're also going through ammunition like crazy. And he's facing, as Susan said, a more united Europe, U.S., Western world, better, cohesion in NATO. The West is more united. Ukraine stands defiant. But the question is, and here is where I want you to pretend to know what we don't know, is how long can this be sustained? At what point are the cracks going to show? We thought they might show during the winter. If Europe had a rough winter, it's been a mild winter, it could have turned out very differently.
Well, look, there's 2 points. Let me address your point really quickly and then get to something that Susan said, because I think, again, who has a crystal ball? But I just was in Washington not too long ago, making the rounds, the White House and Pentagon and whatnot. And one of the things that came to me loud and clearly is time is on Putin's side, not on our side. The longer this goes on, it helps him for 2 reasons. One, as you pointed out, the Russian army clearly is not what it used to be. And he needs some time to retool, retrain, rebuild, and have a new actual offensive. And what is clear on the other side is we're running out of munitions, right? We're firing, and the Ukrainians are time is not on their side. It's not just the Russians need time militarily, but diplomatically, the longer this goes on, as you said, Kim, the cracks begin to emerge in the alliance, right? We've had this, as Susan pointed out before, this weirdness with Erdogan. I think now the Finns are probably going to have to join before the Swedes on NATO, but it's just not Erdogan. You got the Hungarians who Orban refused to shake hands with Zelensky when he showed up in Brussels for the EU summit last week. You have a weird coalition now in Sweden where you have being supported by a far right pro-Russian party within Sweden, the Italian coalition. You got Berlusconi out there saying nice things about Putin. I mean, there are cracks emerging within, and you also still have, on the less extreme side, you still have Macron, who seems to think there is still a deal to be struck with Putin, that every time he brings it up, he angers the Americans and the Poles and the Baltics. So again, both from a military point of view and from a diplomatic point of view, time is not on the West side. So I think we've got to keep that in mind. And I think that is very much in focus on the Pentagon right now. The other point that I want to get at what Susan said, because I think it's important, is to zoom out a little bit, because Susan was talking about this 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq. We've had a lot of these 20th anniversaries, right? We had the 20th anniversary of September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan. And one of the things I remember most distinctly from that period, having covered the Pentagon at the time, was there was a lot of hand-wringing about fighting the last war, right? We had not retooled from the Cold War to fight Islamist extremism, and then we had this whole debate about irregular warfare and counterinsurgency warfare. And in about 10 years, CIA hired a bunch of Eric speakers. We retooled for counterinsurgency warfare, light warfare, and now you talk to people and like, have we done the same thing? We are fighting the last war. We are not prepared for, amphibious assaults in China or in Asia, or an old-fashioned Cold War style fold the gap ground war in Europe. And I think suddenly, and we had an interview with Millie on this, they're running out of weaponry. The U.S. defense industry is not tooled enough to build enough guided munitions to supply the Ukrainians at a rate they are now. And it's not only just to help the Ukrainians, we're now worried about, actually, do we have the stockpiles for two-theater warfare or a Chinese scenario or whatnot? And I think we're going to have another, have we fought the last war, and are we in need of a rethinking of our whole Pentagon planning on this front? And I think it's when you step back, that's a real nervousness as well.
Absolutely. We have to wrap up soon, but I did want to go to Prashant for a last point, because as Susan said, and it's so true, and thank you for saying it, we forget sometimes about the impact on people. We're sitting in capitals in Washington, in New York, etc. But war and upheaval are, taking their toll on the Ukrainians. And also, it's hard to keep the unity, perhaps sometimes even inside the country. There's been scandals of corruption, which Zelensky's dealt with quickly. But at some point, human nature might mean that Ukrainians will also say, look, we're tired. We've had enough. We need to talk. We need to find a way out of this, and it's not war. Prashant, give us your 30 seconds on the sort of the human toll that this war is taking on Ukrainians.
I thought Susan gave a fantastic summary. I think often in this war, a friend of mine in Iraq, after we covered a particularly sort of grim bombing, we were headed back to the office, and he said, before 2003, even during the heinous days of Saddam, most Iraqis died of old age and sort of quasi-natural circumstances caused by, of course, the privations of the Saddam regime and all these things. But now, he told me this was years ago, but still, he told me now when somebody in Iraq dies of old age, we say they are the lucky ones. And I think about that a lot with, Iraq today, but, much calmer country, but Ukraine is certainly fallen victim to this as well, I think.
Absolutely. I wish this conversation had been a bit more positive. I'm it is heartbreaking, but this is what we do, and it's important that we have these conversations, and I hope people will tune in. These subjects, these stories will stay with us in the coming months, including the earthquake and Ukraine. But for now, I want to thank you, Susan Glasser, Peter Spiegel, Prashant Rao, for your wisdom and contribution to this great conversation, and for making my job filling in for Ivo so easy. The World Review will be back next week for another edition. Until then, thanks for tuning in and have a great weekend.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.